Welcome to the 7th and final session of our Impactability Learning Series with hosts Al Admansky and Vicki Kamak. This webinar series has had as its focus the impactability of individuals in the disability movement. Al and Vicki recognize that people with disabilities and their families have a distinct talent for achieving impact, largely because they are continuously inventing and recreating their way out of adversity. Today's session is entitled, Think and Act Like a Movement. Al and Vicki have invited Alexandra Samuel to join them in the conversation. Alexandra is a technology researcher, writer, and blogger. I anticipate that today's discussion will assist you to explore the changing nature of our relationship with technology and its impact on ourselves, our families, and our movements. My name is Ted Kuntz. I am the chair of Plan Institute, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Plan Institute is a social enterprise whose main objectives are to improve the lives of people with disabilities by offering a suite of learning initiatives, by advocating for policy reform, and by collaborating on impact-based community projects. In fact, our focus on community impact led us to Tamarack Institute. Tamarack is one of the world's leading organizations in collective community impact, and they are our key partner for this learning series. I'm delighted, as always, to welcome and introduce our hosts, Al Admansky and Vicki Kamak. Al and Vicki are dynamic individuals who are recognized worldwide as social innovation leaders, as well as passionate contributors to the global family movement. Al and Vicki are the co-founders of Plan and Plan Institute. And while both have been recognized with many awards over the years, one being the Order of Canada, they both still consider themselves to be observers, students, and guides of social innovation, scale, impact, and sustainability. Good morning, Al and Vicki. It's always a pleasure to share time with you both. Thank you for developing this Impactability series. And now I'll turn it over to you to introduce your special guest.
Thanks, Ted. And welcome, everyone, wherever you may be listening from. It's so nice to have all of you with us again. Vicki and I are very excited to begin our chat with today's guest, Alex Samuels, who we will introduce to you very shortly. But first, a few words about this pattern, thinking and acting like a movement. This pattern is not so much about creating a new movement, although some of you may want to do that. It's really more about becoming a responsible contributor to the movements, and I say movements, you are already part of. Because the one thing we know for certain is that each of you is already part of several movements. For example, most of you would identify, I'm sure, as being part of the disability movement, or perhaps you're also part of the independent living movement, or the neurodiversity movement, or the inclusion movement. For the sake of today's discussion, we'll probably focus more on the family arm of the disability movement. Although I'm sure you realize, even from this short little list, that one of the ways of strengthening the movements you are already part of is to make sure that the various movements are in alignment with each other. You'd be surprised at how often movements work at cross purposes. So here's the thing. Movements do two things so much better than other organizational forms, such as committees or task forces or partnerships, nonprofit organizations, government, businesses, coalitions, or federations. So here's what movements do. There's two things that I'd like to focus on. One, movements shift the boundaries of what is socially acceptable and expected. They provide a climate for new ideas, for changing culture. And by culture, I mean those deeply rooted habits and attitudes and beliefs that keep things the way they are. No matter how successfully our strategies might be in the short term, those habits and beliefs often act like an anchor. The second thing that movements do is that they embolden politicians because they create the favorable political conditions for the combination of legislative change, resource allocation, policy shifts, new stories, and new behaviors that we're looking for. So here's a very short formula that I follow for social change. Popular support comes before political change. And you can't get popular support without having strong movements.
Good morning, everyone. Alexandra Samuels has studied the bonds that hold people together, what some people might call social capital, since she was at Harvard doing her PhD. Alex has a particular interest and deep expertise in the bonds that develop among people online. She looks at technology from the perspective that it's here to stay, so let's maximize the benefits and minimize the negatives. Alex's prowess as an online strategist has helped a variety of community organizations and businesses. A little over a decade ago, she dragged me into the online world. I was quite the Luddite, and Alex's enthusiasm and grasp of the possibilities of the web to tie us together was a major catalyst for the creation of Ties Personal Networks, a social purpose business I founded with Plan several years ago. Today, you can take a variety of valuable and entertaining classes from Alex on things like increasing your email productivity, managing your kids' screen time, how to use online games and activities to connect to grandchildren. Alex has also written for several platforms, as varied as Oprah, the Harvard Business Review, and Wall Street Journal. And her latest book is Work Smarter with Social Media. She is also the sole writer for the Peanut Diaries, an account of the majestic and tumultuous life with her talented and temperamental son, whose online name is Peanuts. Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, when I first met you all those years back, you didn't at that time identify personally with the broader disability movement. In fact, I can remember being at your home when Peanuts was really maybe a week or two old at that point. Yeah. But today, now courtesy of Peanuts, you've joined the royal family, and we'd just love to hear a little bit more to start things off about you and your family, and particularly about Peanuts.
So yes, it's true. I'm sure I remember very clearly, Vicki, that when you and I met at Hollyhock, I was about 6 months pregnant with Peanut, you know, I think working with you and Al was our first experience really working with the disability movement, although we've worked with other organizations since then. And you know, in terms of our own personal journey, I should say, you know, Peanut was only actually officially diagnosed as autistic less than a year ago. I guess I myself have kind of had that diagnosis in my head for maybe a year and a half, 2 years. But I suspect, like a lot of families whose kids have you know, invisible disabilities or developmental disabilities that you know, that are hard to diagnose, we kind of found a gradual path into this community. And I would say, so he's 10 now. I probably started describing myself as a special needs mom when he was about 6, and I did it very apologetically because I felt like it wasn't an accurate description. It was just my shorthand for explaining to people what my parenting experience was like, because I had this child who, you know, was the subject of kind of emergency calls from the principal 3 or 4 times a week. And so, you know, we very much had the experience of special needs parenting without having any kind of formal label for quite a while, and then over time kind of picked up a variety of labels and eventually had an autism assessment that's, you know, where the result was, you know, no, your child doesn't have 7 different diagnoses, he's autistic. And I think that for me, part of the value of that journey has been really really having to negotiate the relationship between the experience of being part of the special needs community in the sense of having like very real challenges that are, I think, different from a neurotypical parenting experience. And on the other hand, you know, I think there's so much anxiety people have about labels, and you know, the labels like autism are so powerful in certain ways, and they're certainly powerful when it comes to helping us feel like part of a larger community and potentially part of a movement. And at the same time, I'm really struck by how much fear there still is around claiming a label like that. And even though it has, for us, been so far nothing but beneficial in both tangible and intangible ways, not the least for Peanut himself, who clearly has found it very reassuring to describe himself as autistic. I was just talking to a mother recently who has a son who sounds quite a lot like my guy, except her son is 25, and you know, she was quite shocked that we had been so willing, not just willing, but eager really to have him assessed and to have this label that makes him quote unquote disabled. Because from her perspective, and I think this is really as much as anything about how much the world has changed in the past 15 years, you know, she really saw being autistic as this terrible burden for, you know, a kid to carry as a label. And I think that, you know, that's where a lot of our work still needs to be done, right, is helping people destigmatize labels so that they can serve us in all the ways that they're useful.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a really major paradox that we live with, and that we, you know, have for many, many years worked so hard to be a part of and included in everything, and labels were separating and segregating for people. And one of the major shifts that's happening now is something I think you alluded to, which is a certain pride in the label. You know, there's a disability pride emerging. There is value, not only on a practical level of knowing what's going on, but also on not seeing it necessarily as a negative. And so that's, you know, your experience, I think, truly does reflect some of the current wave that's beginning to emerge in the movement. I'm curious for you right now, you know, do you find that you feel like you're part of the movement?
You know, it's a really interesting question. I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, and so much of that for me really has been facilitated by my various online communities in different ways. You know, certainly as I have moved through the various challenges we've had with Peanut, and maybe I should in a moment say a little more about that because I realize I haven't been that descriptive. It's been, you know, hugely useful and informative for me to connect with other parents in a variety of online communities, you know, just for really practical, both sort of support and reality check and you know, resources, advice. I mean, pretty early in my parenting journey, yeah, I was part of a parenting group of moms who I mostly knew socially, and it was really nice for a while. And then, like, you know, as we started running into these issues with Peanut, and I suspect this will be familiar to other people as well, right? We would have experiences like, you know, I would have gotten called to school because he had freaked out in class and had, like, hidden somewhere in the school for an hour and they'd had to search for him. Or I had been, you know, out at a coffee shop with him and he'd had a total meltdown because he wanted a brownie and he's, like, kicking and screaming and I'm having to, like, peel him off the table and get him out of the coffee shop. And, you know, like, that very quickly became our normal. I won't pretend it was a party, but, you know, that was my normal. And I would go to my mom's group and talk about these experiences, and everybody's jaws would be like on the table. And, you know, because their big drama was like, you know, little Petal didn't want to wear a pink tutu for her ballet recital, but then she did, and she did great, right? It's like totally different reality. And it just got to be too painful to be trying to like engage around my parenting experience with people whose experience was so different. And so, you know, in the first instance, my connection to, you know, the disability community was really through fellow parents, many of whom identified with this label 2E, twice exceptional, which, you know, is used to describe kids who are gifted and also have either learning disabilities or other kinds of, you know, cognitive and developmental disabilities. And often, you know, with kids who are autistic, you see that pattern of being very bright and also having some pretty significant challenges. But at the same time, I think partly because, you know, of the kind of work we've done with you and the fact that I have a, you know, big network in the nonprofit world, but also because of, you know, just some personal relationships I have with friends who are part of the disability community, I became conscious of like seeing more news stories. And again, you never know what is Facebook feeding you stuff because they figured out what you're interested in. But I, you know, as I was sort of seeing more news stories about various aspects of disability rights and politics, reading more and more, and increasingly kind of seeing that as my community as well. And certainly, you know, things like the current, being like literally at this moment, they're voting on whether to confirm Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education in America. And you know, her position or really lack of knowledge around disability education has been a key conversation point. And I definitely feel like those are my people. I feel like very deeply invested in that, and not just in an abstract way, because when I speak, as I do now, about some of our experiences, and it's often around kind of technology, those are the moms who come up to me. The people who come up to me after I speak are not the people who want to talk about, you know, software design. They're the moms who've like spent, you know, 2 years battling their local school board to get accommodations for their autistic kid. And so I just think as a parent, I don't know how I could fail to feel like part of that movement.
You know, I know you and Rob are both real, you know, social activists in many, many different ways. And this next question, I think, is something that affects so many of us in this world, you know, about how we actually can balance our many involvements and commitments to social change with the requirements of parenting. I know when Al interviewed Marianne Thompson, the founder of the Lalesh League, she said she built the breastfeeding online community or movement by using what she called mother-sized jobs. And she wanted to send a signal that all contributions were welcome and that every individual or family could decide what that should be. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, you know, how do you balance your many involvements and commitment to social change with, again, the requirements for parenting?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, and it's one that I've been discussing recently quite a lot on Facebook, as it, of course, in part because the night of the U.S. election, you know, as people were starting to talk online about how their kids were responding to the election result in the States, I started a Facebook group called Parenting in Hard Times, just really to talk about this specific question, like how do we talk to our kids about this moment? What is our how do we balance our social commitments and our family commitments? And I would say that in general, I'm always leery of any balance paradigm. We hear that a lot around, I mean, in a way, this is just a variant on the whole like work-life balance conversation, which I think is based on a really, you know, sort of a false dichotomy. And I think in this world where we're accessible to the office to, you know, we're accessible to the office at 9 o'clock at night on our cell phones. We're accessible to our children at the office because our children have cell phones too. You know, we're accessible to the movement all the time, right? The last thing I look at most nights before I go to sleep is Facebook, and there's usually somebody talking about their latest, you know, activist concern. And so to try and think we can balance that, I think is quite hopeless and not really even desirable. I think the question is how to integrate those pieces. And so, you know, I really struggled for a long time about whether to write about my experience with Peanut. And in fact, one of the first things I wrote about our experience, you know, as parents of an autistic kid was this piece I wrote for the Wall Street Journal about a year ago called Personal Technology and the Autistic Child. And my editors were really concerned. I mean, they're super sweet guys, and they, you know, sort of triple checked with me, like, are you really sure you're comfortable writing about this, about your son? This is his life too, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I just really, and this is something I've talked about with Peanut as well, is, you know, this is the work that I find myself doing, is this really complicated job of parenting. We're really fortunate in terms of our particular professional skill set. I'm a writer, I'm pretty tech savvy, I'm pretty well networked, that we're in a position to share that experience in ways that can be of service. So rather than sort of asking, like, how can I find 4 hours a week to be socially engaged while in the middle of this, like, extremely demanding parenting job, I really tried to look for ways of merging that work of parenting with my social commitments. And I think to some extent we're, you know, that's been successful. And I feel like, you know, the work, part of what's so incredibly rewarding about writing about this experience is that unlike a lot of the work I do where I feel like I'm really measuring in quantity how many thousands of people retweeted something, like when I write a Peanut Diaries thing and I hear from one parent who said, wow, that was super helpful because I'm having the exact same experience and reading your piece made me feel less alone. Like, that's it, that's the payoff. So that's how I look at it is, you know, I think we have to find ways of making our lives and our activism the same thing.
So Alex, I'd like to shift a little bit more and dive into this world of technology and the internet and begin to tease out some of its implications for movements. And so maybe this is a bridging question, but I know you've written about technology and mindfulness, which when I read that I thought those seem to be polar opposites. But I think in many ways it reflects your embrace of technology for positive outcomes. But you know, maybe even on a practical level, what is the relationship between technology and mindfulness?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people do perceive them in opposition to one another, and there's this whole idea that, you know, technology is so endlessly distracting and so disconnecting and alienating. We're so busy responding to the latest tweets or, you know, photographing our breakfast for Instagram that we no longer have the ability to be truly present. And there's no doubt that technology poses lots of challenges for kind of mindful presence. I would certainly remind people that the whole idea of this whole fascination with mindfulness, which, you know, I think is hugely valuable, is actually quite recent in the West, right? And in fact, I suspect the internet has played a pretty significant role in spreading access to mindfulness tools. I mean, one of the blogs I write for is run by Headspace, which is a very successful meditation app, and I am among, you know, it's interesting. I'm among many people who have found, you know, meditation a lot easier with the support of technology. I was interested when I went, the one time I went to a face-to-face support group for parents with kids who have various disabilities. Pretty much everybody in the room spoke about their experience using a mindfulness app as one of their coping strategies. So, to think that technology is the enemy of mindfulness, I think overlooks the way it can really support that. And so one piece of that is using specific technologies that are designed to support mindfulness. But I think also it's about kind of shifting our experience of technology and our use of technology to be more intentional. And so, really tangible example, I'm a criminal in this regard, is how many tabs, how many tabs and windows you have open on your computer is not a bad indicator of how fragmented your attention is at any given moment. But there's no intrinsic requirement of your software that you have 250 tabs and windows open. You can choose to do one thing on your computer at a time and turn off all the notifications and the pings and not check your email and give something your full attention on a screen. Just as you can choose to give something your full attention off screen. And I think if we stop positioning technology as the enemy of mindfulness, then we can actually start to embrace the challenge of bringing a quality of presence and intention to our time online.
Alex, I think your phrase when you began this answer, photographing breakfast for Instagrams, I think that could be a title of a book.
I think it might be.
I just want to say that the line broke up a little bit, and
sorry.
It may be originating with you, or it may be more general, but just mention that to you. I'd like to read a quote to you, Alex, that you wrote. People working in the field of social media bear a particular responsibility for imagining, interrogating, and forming this new world that is just beginning. For what use is our insatiable appetite for connectivity, or our constant embrace of new tools, or our perpetually self-reflecting conversation, if not for the job of shaping this new world with some degree of insight and deliberateness? Now, when I read that, I thought, boy, you could substitute disability movement, and and the quote would ring quite fine, and I think would reflect what many families, individual supporters, friends, etc., feel about their movement responsibilities, if you will. So to me, this is a perfect segue into beginning to look at how this new technology, the field of social media, the web, can help us with strengthening the movements they're part of. Do you have I'm sure you have more thoughts on this, and I'd really like to hear your reflections on this, because I think my sense is that you inhabit that online world more than the majority of people who are on this on this webinar.
Yes, I'm afraid I probably inhabit the online world more than most people with a strong sense of self-preservation. I'd have to look at the quote, and that's whatever. I'm dying to know where you found that, because I feel like I must have written that quite a long time ago, although I don't disagree with it, which I guess is a good sign. I have to see it to think about the analogy to the disability movement. I think you said at the beginning of the call, you talked about the sort of experience, actually I think it might have been Vicki, you talked about the experience that many people have, of sort of the advocacy flowing from, initially, or their political engagement flowing from, initially their advocacy for themselves or their children. And I think that is where we need to kind of put some attention into the ecosystem of the internet and its sort of movement capacity, because there's so much of what happens online, around disability is really in the context of practical support. And it's quite extraordinary, really, how successful. I mean, one of the areas where I think the internet has been most successful, perhaps next to online dating, is in allowing people to get support for a wide range of health conditions. So you see all kinds of support groups for every possible disease, form of mental illness, disability community. Zillions and zillions of parenting groups of every flavor, and yet, at least in the communities I'm a part of, there's remarkably little political engagement, and in part I think that's out of a desire to avoid conflict. Every parenting group I am part of has it seems like there's an annual schism over vaccination, and there's an annual schism over, religion. And so I think that a lot of communities of support are inhibited in terms of shifting into political engagement because of that concern. But I think there are ways of moving people towards advocacy that don't have to be partisan and don't have to endanger the relationships and trust that people depend on in those communities. And it's actually incredible. I'm trying to think now. I don't think I've seen anything about Betsy DeVos, for example, in any of my disability parenting communities. I mean, what is up with that? How do you not, and these are groups that are overwhelmingly American. I mean, how are we not talking about the fact that the potential nominee for the potential Secretary of Education is somebody who doesn't really understand the role of government in providing fair access to education for kids with disabilities? And that's shocking to me. And so I think there's, it's very sensitive territory, but I think it is very fertile ground for community organizers in the disability movement.
Alex, are there examples of, because really it's about learning from all movements. Are there movements that have embraced technology and have achieved some impact? Are there, as you look around there, are there models to follow, to be curious about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are lots of moments, and I fear my reference points are mostly going to be quite dated. In a way, the sort of inception point for online activism is going back, gosh, I guess 20 years now, to the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which, trying to remember how this all played out, but fundamentally that was sort of the first time there was large-scale online organizing of protests, and certainly the street protests were really important, but so were various petition campaigns around the world. And at the time, nobody was thinking about online organizing, and so it was really this, like, it just kind of came out of the blue as far as elected politicians were concerned, that people were organizing online in order to challenge this agreement. And since then we've seen every year or two some similarly massive online movement. There was Move On during the Clinton impeachment scandal, and then, gosh, I'm suddenly blanking on more recent examples. I think what's changed in more recent years is that we see, well, I mean, you've got to say that Standing Rock, coming much more recently, obviously the camp and the physical protest was hugely powerful, but the impact of that protest was certainly amplified online, and the size of the protest was certainly fed online. And so, I think we need to recognize that in most cases the power of the internet really works synergistically with offline politics of different sorts. So, the internet is really good at organizing and enlarging physical protest. Certainly the Women's March that happened right after Trump's election would not have been nearly that scale if it hadn't been for online organizing, and the pink hats that were the big success of the sort of visual culture of that protest. That was something that was organized and shared online. And then when you do have physical protest events, they're very much amplified online. So, I think I don't think it's a matter of online organizing replacing offline activism as much as it is harnessing it. And then we can talk a little bit about some of the new forms of engagement that become possible too.
Okay. Well, great. Actually, that's a great segue into wanting to explore a little bit about how can the family arm of the disability movement really, in a sense, mobilize and become more active. Our sense is that the movement is facing two big challenges, and one of which you actually already alluded to, which is the factionalization. Sometimes it might be between things, like the larger issues that you spoke about related to religion or vaccinations, and sometimes it's about something very specific related to particular treatments or interventions or educational processes around a particular disability. But that factionalization does separate us from one another at times. And then the other challenge is to think about how can we engage younger families and in a way that's really relevant for 2017.
Those are two huge questions. Yeah, I think let's start with the factionalization, and this is really just my own observation. I think part of the magic of the internet is also its limitation. So, the reason I get my support mostly online and not face-to-face is because, I have found that in terms of the practicalities of navigating our challenges with Peanut, most of them are pretty narrow and specific to the 2E world, the twice exceptional world. And, a really important mentor for me in this has been a friend who has kids, or two autistic kids who are, about 10 years older than mine and who are also very gifted. And, she sort of said to me early on when I was talking to her about my struggle that she had sort of given up on, any parenting group that was focused on either giftedness or autism, because really unless she was kind of in a community of people who had both sides of that equation, the challenges were just too different. And so, the beauty of the internet is that, how many kids are there, how many families are there in Vancouver who have, like pretty intensely challenging autistic kids who are also like 99th percentile IQ? I don't know, 10? But on the internet, there's, thousands. And so there's kind of critical mass to be able to find people with your very specific, challenge. But the flip side of that is that the more time you spend with people in your teeny niche, the less obvious your investment is in the community as a whole. And, I'm somebody who comes to this experience with a background in social activism, with a set of political commitments, with some experience with the disability movement in particular. And so, I have a kind of ideological inclination to see the commonality and to identify, yeah, I'm pretty privileged in a lot of ways, as is Peanut. And so our challenges might look quite different from the challenges of, a family in rural BC who has a child who is dealing with, cerebral palsy, but we have a common set of political interests on X, Y, and Z issue. I don't think those connections are obvious to a lot of people. And so I think as a movement, we really need to start articulating for people, where the commonalities lie and finding our way into those niche communities where people live on a day-to-day basis so that we can start to help them see their connection to those larger issues. But we're not going to succeed on doing that with 50 issues. We kind of have to pick the 2 or 3 that we think are going to have broadest resonance and learn how to organize on an issue-by-issue basis rather than expecting to build some kind of like stable movement that will be there for us issue after issue, year after year.
So Alex, on forgive my pea brain about this, but let's say there are 1,000 bloggers out there, and they have audiences varying from, a dozen to thousands.
Yeah.
And you're sitting in, let's for the sake of argument, because I know we have folks from New Zealand listening in. Let's say you're in New Zealand, and you want to refresh the family arm of the disability movement. And there are all those parents out there, and they're not showing up at the meetings. Some are, yeah, but most aren't, because for all the reasons that you've just described, it's a real insight for us to listen to you and how you negotiate the challenges compared to, let's say, how parents did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So on a practical level, how would you go about that? Would you create a separate website and reach out to all those people? Would you create a digest? How would you actually, on a practical level, link all those people, find them, and then link them up?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I do really think you have to be specific. It helps to have a very particular issue you're trying to mobilize people on. So, I would start. It is about building lists. Obviously, you do want to kind of acquire people's emails so you can contact them. But you want to keep your kind of family advocacy network separate from your main email list, because you're going to tire them out if you email them every week with all your organization's news. So I would think about, having a strategy that's sort of this 2-tier. You have your kind of inner core of people who are super committed to your organization, and then you have this sort of larger network you can draw on when you need volume and amplification. So, let's say there's a piece of legislation that you're concerned about or that you're lobbying for. And I'm going to say, something around education is often going to be the issue. So, in fact, if you don't mind, I know I keep coming back to Betsy DeVos, and what can I say? It is very much of the moment. So let's say you've got a candidate like that for a government position who you feel like is not going to be sympathetic to issues in disability education. That's where what you're really trying to do is mobilize people with very specific calls to action, right? You want these folks to call their MP or their MLA or their congressman or whoever it is. You want them to sort of speak up in various ways online, maybe even get them out to a rally. You have to start by tapping into the narrative that links you together. And it seems weird to describe this as good news, but let's be honest, one resource that you can pretty well count on among families with children who have different kinds of special needs is they've all been pissed off at the education system at some point. I mean, really, really mad. So, you need to tap that anchor and let people see that, you know, even if the issue that is on the table today isn't the exact issue that drove them crazy when they were dealing with their local public school, it is of a piece, and it's about, you know, the overall orientation of the education system. And then what you want to do is, you know, start to, you know, engage those folks, build their awareness of your organization's name and of the issue, probably not by necessarily creating a new website, but by creating, you know, sort of shareable assets. So you're looking for really heartfelt personal stories that are going to make people go ballistic or cry. You're looking for, and actually I should just pause there. I read a piece recently, I just was doing some research on kind of the mommy blogging phenomenon, and I read this really interesting analysis that sort of showed that the most sort of widely shared and popular kinds of blog posts, and it really resonated with me because I wrote a piece like this about Peanut that went crazy big. People love these, like, you know, stories of people overcoming, and I'm sure many people on this call sort of share my aggravation with, like, how much people want to be inspired by our heartfelt tales of overcoming disability, but God, people love them. And by the way, if folks aren't watching the TV show Speechless, the most recent episode sends up that whole paradigm so brilliantly. I just can't recommend it enough. But that said, give the people what they want. Give them your heartfelt blog post if that's what they'll share. Make infographics and images with inspiring quotes, and, you know, all of these little elements that will resonate with parents who have had these experiences. And then ask people who are part of your inner circle to start sharing those on their own Facebook walls and Twitter accounts and in the various online communities they're part of, and let them spread within those existing communities. You don't need to start new ones. And then as you start to build awareness of your organization, then you can start to put in, you know, on those shareables, you know, does this make you angry? Do you want to, you know, speak up on, you know, education access? Sign our petition here, or, you know, and you start then using those shareables to channel people to your site, to sign up for your list, to give you, you know, to sign your petition, to visit the webpage that tells them how to call their representative. But really, it's about, I think, spreading your message through those existing channels.
Well, clearly so much insight here, Alex, and really speaks to the value of, if you're moving forward, to having a sophisticated online strategist on board to help with the efforts. I want to take us down a few thousand feet from where we've been, thinking largely about movement building, and just get quickly to a final question here on a very personal level that many of our listeners might be struggling with, which is how do they support their own children in limiting or making available even online time? So a couple of quick tips would be fantastic.
Oh gosh, so hard. Yeah, so I mean, this is where I've ended up doing a lot of my writing because, you know, for two reasons. One is, you know, I have this kid who, you know, I now have done quite a bit of research around autism and technology, and it turns out that it's not my imagination that my kid is even more drawn to all things video than your typical kid. A lot of autistic kids really struggle with what some people term video gaming addiction. I might just call it compulsion. And then because he's super bright, he's really, really good at coming up with getting around my various parental restrictions. And then because I'm a nerd, I am perfectly happy to spend 10 hours a week refining my parental restrictions regime. So, you know, because of that, I do end up giving a lot of folks advice around their kids' technology use, and I've also done a study of about 10,000 North American parents and how they approach this. I think the most important general advice is that it certainly seems from the data that the most successful strategy is not to focus on minimizing your kids' screen use, and it's also not to give them unlimited access. It's really to help your kids learn how to use technology effectively and to actively guide them in their tech use. And yeah, that does mean you have to invest some time in thinking about the tech world, getting to know the different platforms your kids use. You know, a really common pain point I hear from a lot of people, and God knows I've been there myself, is the endless yak about Minecraft at the dinner table. It's just like, seriously, how many hours a day are you expected to talk about Minecraft? Well, it turns out I have discovered that if you play Minecraft with your child, they actually yak about it a lot less. And it's incredibly meaningful to your kids. I mean, if you are willing to engage with them in their online passions, whatever it is, if it's a video game, if it's watching their incredibly annoying YouTube videos, you know, your relationship with your child will only be strengthened by engaging with their passion. And for a lot of kids, this is their area of passion. At the same time, you know, there is a place for setting some hard limits. And particularly if you have a kid who struggles with kind of compulsive technology use, I'm a really big fan of sitting down as a family, coming to an agreement about how much time, what kinds of time you want your kid to spend online, and what their positive aspirations are for how to use that time. And then once you have that agreement, you know, back it up with, you know, different kinds of hard limits on your network. I use now a tool called Circle, which is actually made by Disney, to enforce our agreements. You know, if we're only going to have 2 hours of gaming allowed a day, I know only may seem like a weird word in that context, then Circle cuts you off after 2 hours.
So, Alex, we are perilously close to our ending here. I want to bring Ted in for perhaps a final comment or question. And Ted, one of the things that's pretty clear to me now, as old timers, I'm going to include you in that phrase. I think we have to accept that we're no longer the main players in our movement, and it's time to shine a light on younger parents and the great work they are already doing to bring people together and to learn from them. Your final thoughts and reflections for this topic and for Alex's marvelous responses.
Well, Al, I would agree with you. I'm one of those people that have been reluctant to engage into this internet technology. It's still foreign to me. But I've also come to recognize how powerful it is, and in some of the work that I've done and the movements that I'm a part of, I realize that you know, the struggles that we have locally here are national and international, that we really are part of a global community, and we share a human experience, that we have allies around the world. And I'm constantly amazed how many times I open up my computer and there's a request to join my Facebook from people all around the world, because somehow or other they have you know, heard something or read something that I might have produced, and they want to be part of that movement. And so there is power in this, but I think you're right, Al, is that the younger parents like Alex, they love this stuff, and they're the ones to begin to carry this forward. So thank you. It was a rich discussion, Al, Vicki, and Alex. It helps us to understand that if we're going to be impactful in our movements, that we need to use the tools that are available to us to have impact. So we need to bring this to a close. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say thank you for having me.
Thanks, Alex.
It's been great, Alex.
I just want to say that this webinar series would not have been possible without the support of our amazing partners. And these partners, along with the teams at Plan and Plan Institute and Tamarack, are making an impact every day, both in our local communities and with individuals right across Canada and beyond. And since this is our final webinar series, I just just want to take a moment and reflect on some of the ways in which we've been inspired by these meaningful conversations that Al and Vicky have brought to us over these past several weeks. We've been privileged to learn from 7 inspirational change makers whose work and unique impact abilities exemplify important aspects of creating meaningful and lasting impact. And we've also had the opportunity to strengthen our own effectiveness at advancing positive change both in the disability movement and beyond by rethinking the ways in which we engage with one another, with our communities, our organizations, our systems, our friends, and our families. To all of those who are online here, if you've not had the opportunity to listen to all of the previous webinars, you need to know that they are available on YouTube and through the Plan Institute and Tamarack websites. And links will be provided to you in a following up email. Plan Institute has more exciting events and resources available, and I encourage you to visit our website at planinstitute.ca or rdsp.com and learn more. In addition, please visit our partner Tamarack's website, who organize and host many community building programs and workshops across Canada. There are 2 events coming up that may be of interest. One is in Vancouver. You can register now to join Tamarack for a 3-day event in March on community engagement. And in April, they are doing an event in Hamilton, Ontario called Cities Reducing Poverty. Later this week, we will be sending you an email with links to the audio and material related to today's webinar, including a discount code to purchase your own copy of Impact. And we always welcome your feedback, so email us if you have feedback. Al, Vicky, thank you again for being the innovators that you are. We honor your passion and your commitment to making the world a better place for all of us. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. And so until next time, we wish you well. Thank you.